Hey everyone, welcome to the Darshan Talks podcast. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help you trust the products you depend on. And today's conversation is going to be about products you depend on that you need to learn to trust. So as you may know, I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA-regulated products. So if you think about drugs, wonder about devices, obsess over pharmacy, or ponder over psychedelics, this is the podcast for you. Just to be clear, both me and my guest are attorneys. Neither one of us are giving you clinical advice. Sorry, are giving you legal advice. I'm a pharmacist. I'm not giving you clinical advice. And this is just for educational reasons and for sort of a conversation and for entertainment. So I do these video podcasts because they're a lot of fun and because I find myself learning something new each time. It'd be great to know if someone's listening. So if you like what you hear, please leave a comment, please subscribe. If you like what my guest is saying, feel free to contact him. Maybe he can help you. Please share this conversation if you think someone would enjoy the conversation. If you want to find me, you can reach out to me on Twitter at Darshan Talks, or just go to our website at darshantalks.com. Today's podcast is going to be about psychedelics, and I'm really excited about this because this is a conversation that I've seen for a long time coming. But our guest today can talk about it, and he's been a guest with us before, but we didn't have this conversation, so I'm really excited about it. So if you are in cannabis and you're wondering what do products that are not cleanly regulated by the FDA say and do, if you are in pharma wondering how can you get it into the psychedelic space and what are the concerns around it, if you're in the psychedelic space and trying to understand what that means, you're going to have a great time with today's discussion. Our guest today is... there we go. Hold on. Our guest today is Dr. Whitelaw. He's a consultant, he's a professor, and he is a journal editor. And as any good attorney will do, he has not named any of the companies he works for, which is why we know he is a good attorney. And I know he doesn't work as an attorney, but he works as a consultant. So he works primarily in the risk management space, and we hopefully might get into that discussion a little bit as well. So I really recommend you sort of listen in, ask questions. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest for today is Seth Whitelock. Hey, Seth, how are you?
I'm good, Darshan. It's good to see you again.
It's great to see you. It's different this time because you don't have a pipe in your mouth, and that is...
I put it aside just for you.
Having said that, I love your chair, which is very much a gamer's chair. So I didn't peg you as a gamer. For all I know, you are. Are you a gamer?
I learned to game because I got into a little bit with my kids, but the main reason I have a gamer's chair was I was looking for a really good, comfortable desk chair. And both of my boys, who are avid gamers, said, "You got to get a gaming chair, Dad."
Really?
Yeah.
Would not have realized that. I thought gaming chairs, I don't know why. I thought they'd be different and have different goals. I've become obsessed by chairs recently because I need to buy one. And I keep going down the Herman Miller path. And I don't want to pay, I think last night I checked like $1,600 for a Herman Miller chair. I'm like, I'm not paying. So
yeah, that's a lot. Gaming chairs tend to be a lot less expensive. But they're designed for people, who are going to sit for hours at a time and be comfortable.
Good to know. So that's the cheater's way of getting a good chair without paying through the nose for it. So
absolutely.
Good for you. So we're going to talk about psychedelics. And we're going to talk a little bit about how, and I probably should title this, Not Just Mushrooms, because that's what I think about when I think about psychedelics. So first, let's start by what you told me right before we got on, which is it's not just mushrooms.
It's not just mushrooms. There are a lot of compounds in the psychedelic space, from MDMA being a psychedelic to LSD to mushrooms to, if you're going to go on the radical end of things, toads. There are all sorts of things that fall into ayahuasca. Ibogaine. There are a lot of different psychedelics out there. A lot of them have been around and being used throughout the centuries by indigenous people. Some of them are man-made and newer, like MDMA or LSD. but they run the gamut.
So obviously, like you said, there's between the synthetic and the naturally occurring, they're all considered psychedelics. So what is it that commonly connects all of them?
Basically, they alter your mood, they alter your mind. In the case of MDMA, for example, it tends to relax people. It reduces their inhibitions. So if you're treating mental health, it's a way of trying to using it as a tool to break through barriers with people who have trauma and being able to process the trauma and allow them to be a bit more objective when they're trying to understand what's going on with them.
So it's interesting you say that. You're talking about the for example, you talked about relaxation, which I think is really interesting. But thinking about what's in the news right now from an FDA perspective, and I know you follow it as much as I do, being someone who I believe you were a fellow of FDLI, weren't you?
Yes, I was a Food and Drug Law Institute fellow years ago.
So you are what most people would consider, and I know we aren't allowed to say words like this, so the equivalent of a expert or a specialist. And the reason I say that, I think bar rules prevent us from calling each other that, but to the extent you know a lot about the space, you're very familiar with that space. From an intent of use perspective, when you're talking about a product like mushrooms and LSD and MDMA, why are these not regulated like drugs? And if so, why not?
For the most part, they're not. Well, they are regulated by drugs, Darshan, if you're going to use them for a clinical setting. Okay. Most of these products, though, are controlled one substances under the DEA regs. So DEA has determined, like cannabis, that there are no medical benefits, no medical uses for these products. And as a result, although before they were classified into Schedule 1, there was research done on them. The research is essentially stopped since they've been classified. And so there isn't the research to support the fact that these products can in fact have medicinal purposes and medicinal uses behind them.
So you say that, but we both know that there are organizations that are starting to explore this. How are they exploring the space in a world where they're classified?
Stop. Pardon me.
That's okay.
The way they're exploring the space, quite frankly, Darshan, is most of these folks are exploring the space from the standpoint of mental health. As you and I both know, when you look at pharmaceuticals intended for mental health, there aren't a lot of them. There aren't a lot of options out there. You've got the traditional antidepressants that we've seen. You've got some antipsychotic drugs that are out there. But by and large, mental health is an area that people have not really delved into or touched on because it's incredibly complicated. Because there's not only the component of what the pharmaceutical can do, but there's also the component of needing to pair that with therapy, and how do you blend those two into a cohesive treatment plan for an individual patient.
You say that, but how do you do that without access to the product? And you don't have access to the product because you can't do the research. You can't do the research because it's classified.
Oh, you can. You just have to go. You have to go get special permission from FDA and DEA to be able to do the research, and you need to have a credible clinical trial plan and work from there. But again, one of the things that the psychedelic world, unfortunately, is trying to overcome is the fact that, everybody remembers Timothy Leary. Everybody remembers the Haight-Ashbury days. And so there is an inborn prejudice that against allowing these products to move forward in the normal course of development. They all have risks. They all have risks. They all have risks of abuse. They all have risks associated with them. And there's a fair amount, and like cannabis, there's a fair amount of baggage that goes along with them as well.
Actually, I don't know Timothy Leary or Haight-Ashbury. Can you talk a little bit about what those are?
Sure, we're talking. I'm taking you back to the 1960s, early 70s. Leary was studying LSD for medicinal purposes at one point in time. Haight-Ashbury, was the flower children, and everybody can go use whatever they want and should have, drugs should be decriminalized and everybody should have a right to access whatever the heck they want from those days.
And what happened? Why were those movements unsuccessful?
Well, for the most part, again, these things have risks. These things can hurt you. And so the science wasn't there to establish that they were, unlike opioids, let's say. The science wasn't there to prove that there was a medicinal value, so they got lumped into, well, they have a high risk of abuse, in some cases, high risk of addiction. So there were concerns about that, so they lumped them in. The history is muddy, but it basically goes back to the 1970s and Nixon's war on drugs. So they all kind of put all this stuff into that bucket. So heroin, cannabis, all this stuff got lumped into one big bucket that we know is Schedule 1 these days.
So just going to state the obvious, I've never had heroin, but is heroin, does it have hallucinogenic /
No, heroin does not. Heroin has pain-related and addictive properties. Heroin, if you go back far enough, was actually invented by the Bayer Company. It was used as a cough suppressant years ago. Okay. It's an opium. It's an opium derivative.
I remembered that part. I did not know that. I didn't know what effect it had, but I appreciate you clarifying for others who didn't. The question I had is cannabis is already being in the process of being some version of reclassified, whatever that means, and whatever impact it's going to have. If psychedelics go off that list, what's left on a Schedule 1 list at that point? Sounds like heroin, but
fentanyl, illegal fentanyl probably will be on a Schedule 1. But fentanyl obviously is a Schedule 2 because it does have some medicinal purposes. There's going to be very few things left ultimately. But each one that comes off the list, they're going to have to demonstrate a medical benefit for each one. So it's going to take a while to shrink that list.
Which is true. I guess the question I'm asking without asking it is, do you see that one of the reasons that there has been hesitancy in moving away from moving these Schedule 1 substances and then regulating them is a administrative issue in terms of the DEA loses control over these products in the way that they have?
No, I don't think it's that. I think it's just a prejudice against what some people view as the counterculture, the drug culture. Concerns that we're going to make the population into a bunch of addicts that we're then going to have to deal with. I mean, DEA will still have control over this for the most part, especially if they only allow these to become Schedule 2s, because the only difference between a Schedule 1 and a Schedule 2, honestly, is there's a medicinal use.
Right. So you have interacted and or worked with companies that have this type of product as a end goal. My question for you is, what unique issues do you face when dealing with clients of this variety, if you will?
Well, I guess first and foremost is an understanding of the regulated environment. What is it going to take to prove the thesis that these actually work in a medicinal world? What are adequate and well-controlled studies look like? How do you define those endpoints? And what's also complicating that factor is, are there adequate measures to define those endpoints? Because we're talking about mental health endpoints. We're not talking about just PK values or absorption rates or any of those things. We're talking about having to pair these drugs as a tool with traditional mental health services to get the desired outcome in the end.
So if that's true, why is the situation any different from any other startup in that is it not easy to educate them on this stuff? Or are they reticent?
No, it's not. No, it's not, because a number of folks are in, again, it's changing, and it's changing rapidly because companies are beginning to realize this is an unmet medical need. It is a therapeutic area that has very few players in it. So and mental health is obviously a big issue that's been not addressed for years. But I think when we talk about looking at this from the standpoint of education, a large number of the folks who I work with or interact with, there's also this, well, we think everything should be decriminalized. Everybody should have access to it. We don't understand. There is a sort of a reaction to the government's regulation of it, Big Brother. There's all those kinds of inborn prejudices on the other side as well.
So you have these inborn prejudices. I've found that when you're fighting that, you have to fight the prejudice. You have to address the trust issues before you can start educating them. What have you seen to be a viable strategy in that education? Is it commiserating, or sort of going, look, I recognize you have these problems, but we have other problems to solve? And how do you sort of negotiate to help develop a compliance program for something that is, as you put it, a Schedule I substance that's highly addictive, highly sought after?
Well, I think what I try to use, honestly, Darshan, is try to walk them through the issues that we've seen in the opioid crisis, because I think where the opioids come from and what's come about is an excellent case study. It highlights what the government's concerns are going to be. It highlights how not to get yourself into those kinds of areas in trouble. It highlights the need to have really good data to support what you're trying to do, and robust data around it, and to try to take out, again, the challenge that I work with my clients is, let's take out all of the policy stuff and set that aside, because we can argue policy all day long. Let's just argue the science. Do these things work? Do they not work? If they work, who do they work for? What benefits do they provide? Are the benefits greater than the risks? Let's try to have the conversation around the science, and we'll worry about the policy stuff later. But let's, for now, just focus on the science. And do you have the data to back it up?
So I think you're 100% right that you need to start from the data. You aren't going to convince most policymakers without the data in hand. Having said that, cannabis kind of did it, so it's not an impossible task. Cannabis is still getting a lot of the data that they need in terms of having the adequate, well-controlled trials that the FDA typically is expecting.
Yeah, but unfortunately for psychedelics, yes, there's a huge underground illicit use of them. But unlike cannabis, we don't have a lot of that anecdotal data because people won't talk about it. People are worried about enforcement. The government hasn't taken the same enforcement stance as they have, the sort of hands-off approach that they've been taking with cannabis, at least at the state level. So cannabis has been fortunate at this point, setting aside whether the data that's being generated for cannabis is good or bad, or robust from a FDA adequate and well-controlled study point of view. The massive data around cannabis says, hey guys, there's something here.
Right.
Yeah. Hey, regardless of how regardless of the fact that you say we need additional studies to prove it, we need, to use the FDA gold standard to prove it, et cetera, it's hard to ignore the massive information that's out there. And the number of people who say, look, I get a benefit from it.
So how is this, say, different? And I'm talking now cannabis and psychedelics. How is this different from, say, the situation with hormones and Wyeth, where literally I remember as a pharmacist, and again, I can say this because it's 20 years old and I'm not hopefully implicating a company in this moment, but the recollection then was every woman who was postmenopausal should be on Premarin. I remember when that study came out saying, turns out it's not the greatest idea in the world. Every woman was on it. All the doctors agreed that that is the standard of care. And then this breakout study comes out and destroys everything we thought we knew. In that case, we had some data that suggested that this was a good idea. Cannabis, psychedelics, do we struggle with individual case studies, clumping them together and saying there's something out here compared to
I think you got to separate cannabis from psychedelics. And the reason I say that is where psychedelics seem to be beneficial, at least in the studies that are being done now, has to do with mental health. And that area, as you well know, there's also that difficulty in talking about mental health and viewing mental health issues as being like pain. Like any other disease state, it's something special. It's something different. We tend to bucket it differently. I can remember years ago hearing a talk given by Rosalind Carter about the prejudice around people with mental health issues, and her argument was, I think, the right one, which is, why aren't we treating this just like any other disease state, people? It's not special. It's a biological system that somehow is not working in the way it needs to work.
I'm going to play devil's advocate. I 100% agree with you that we need to go after and treat mental health. The big difference, the big question we have is that for most other disease states, we have objective measures we can use.
That's one of the problems, Darshan, is building those measurements. It's not they're not well established. Right. Yeah, there are scales. There are you name it.
They're all subjective scales.
Yeah, it's kind of like the subjective scales around pain. How do we quantify pain? Exactly. These things, because we're talking about in a way, human feelings. Human perceptions, it's hard to find objective ways to talk about it.
So we are talking about psychedelics. We're talking about Schedule 1 substances. And again, just to clarify and remind people, what is a Schedule 1 substance?
Schedule 1 substance, high risk of abuse or addiction, and no medical benefit.
As opposed to a Schedule 2, which is
high risk of abuse, high risk of addiction, and a medical benefit.
And a medical benefit. Right. So the distinction is just that medical benefit, as you put it.
It's the medical benefit distinction.
So if that's true, and you're developing a compliance program for a psychedelic product that may come to market in the future, how do you begin to sort of create that compliance program?
The same way you complete any compliance program, Darshan. It's not any different. That's the thing. Although that is another thing that I work with my clients, is that the feeling that they're special, that what they're doing is special. Well, yes, it is special because you're working in mental health, and a lot of people don't work there. But as far as how the government views the company, how the government views your control mechanisms, how the government views how you do and conduct studies, you're no different. You're not special. You're just, you in a way are just I hate to put it this way, but essentially you're just another pharmaceutical manufacturer trying to get approval for their product.
I agree. And that's been hard when I talk to individuals who are coming into the space. Yes, you're doing something unique. You're doing something that's special, but not for the reasons you think it is unique and special. It's unique and special because you're treating spaces that have commonly been ignored. And I think it's important that you draw that distinction. Now you've got clients who are saying, I'm special. What do they think they're special for? And how do you sort of address their concerns around it?
Well, the special takes I've seen it take two forms. One is they're special because usually they're small. So there's the size argument that we've heard before in regular pharmaceuticals as well. Um, yes, true. The government may exercise some enforcement discretion based on size, but as we've seen from the recent cases, that distinction is a misnomer and is certainly going away. There's also a sense that they're doing something for the public good, and somehow that's going to insulate them. Again, it's not. You know, if you're marketing something, even if it is for the public good, and you don't have the data to back it up, you're going to be looked at the same way as any other company that doesn't have the data to back it up.
Which is so interesting. Talk to me a little bit more about their perception of they're doing this for the public good. Isn't everyone doing it for the public good? I mean, that's the entire basis on which someone's going to buy something that they think it's going to benefit them.
Yeah, but I think for the most part, the folks that I work with have a greater sense of trying to change the world, if I can put it that way. These are folks who are committed to social justice, who are committed to racial diversity, who are committed to who don't want to be a big for-profit pharmaceutical company, or at least behave in that fashion. Again, nothing wrong with being a big for-profit pharmaceutical company, but we have seen certainly lots of egregious behavior from companies. They don't want to be just motivated by, I guess the better way to put it is, they just want to be motivated by the profit line.
Which is great, but I feel like a lot of companies start out that way. And as they spend billions towards developing their product, they realize that they cannot not charge what is a pretty penny.
Oh yeah, I think these folks realize that, look, you're going to have to but again, I think they're closer to the action around and the debate around when you say charge for a product. What is a reasonable price to charge? It's not doing a Scarelli and charging whatever the market will bear because you control the market. It's not about getting control. It's about helping people and making a reasonable return that then allows you to go look at the next product and maybe help people there. There's a real, I guess the way I can put it is there's a real sense of a do-gooder attitude. Yeah, and that's special because there are a lot of folks who don't have that, but it doesn't insulate you or somehow give you a pass when it comes to enforcement.
So we could keep talking about this because it's such a fascinating area, an emerging area of law and compliance. So thank you for coming and talking about it. As you know, we're going to be asking a few different questions for you to share with the audience. The first is just how can people reach you? And I think I'm sort of putting that up, but for those people who are listening and not watching, how can people reach you, Seth?
Easiest way to reach me is through my email, through my website, whitelawcompliance.com. Those are the fastest ways to get in touch with me.
Very cool.
You can also check out my LinkedIn profile because it has my contact information there. I don't do what a lot of people do, which is just use a Gmail or a Hotmail account. It's actually my company email and ways to get in touch with me.
There you go. My next question for you, based on what we've discussed, what is a question you'd like to ask the audience?
I think the question for the audience would be, where do you see psychedelics going? Do you see psychedelics ever getting to the point where they can overcome the barrier and prejudice?
So my answer would be, I think you're going to have to. So I usually try to answer it first, as you know. So my answer would be, I think what's probably going to happen is that cannabis is going to have to make its way all the way to federal legalization, and you're going to need to have a couple of years between federal legalization and sort of what does that actually mean, and then lawmakers will be more open to exploring psychedelics. I think psychedelics will happen. It's just a question of when.
Okay.
Um,
I happen, Darshan, I happen to agree with you on that. I think because we've also heard the arguments against cannabis about it's going to open up the world and we're going to create a whole population of drug addicts or whatever else somebody wants to throw out there. And I think we are going to have to see that the world isn't going to come to an end when you legalize cannabis.
Right.
Just like it didn't come to an end when we re-legalized alcohol.
Exactly right. I think that's going to be interesting as we continue, because people are going to want to see that and then have their fears calmed, and then the government's going to realize this is another source of revenue. I question whether it's psychedelics or whether it's cannabis, whether the end goal will be medicinal use or actual recreational use. And the point is, you pointed out alcohol. I wonder if the future is they bypass, or at least either bypass or sort of do an intermittent step with the eventual goal of recreational use. But we'll see how that plays itself out.
We'll see how that plays out. Although I tend to think that the way it's going to go is you're at least on the psychedelic front as opposed to the cannabis front. I think you're going to see, because of the nature of what can happen without it being used in a controlled environment and appropriately, I think you're going to see it probably head toward the medicinal.
Interesting.
Even though there's a lot of people advocating and who want to see it be recreationalized, I think in the end, the future, certainly the successful future with the regulators, is going to be going toward the medicinal side of things. I think you're more likely to prevail in that argument.
I think people said the same thing around cannabis, though. Why do you think psychedelics would be different?
I think because again, I think the risks are different. I think the risk profile of cannabis, psychedelics versus cannabis, is very different.
Okay, fair enough.
I think if you want to put it in quote, and I'm putting it in quotes, misuse is different.
Addiction potential.
The implications of misuse are different.
Yeah. The risks are higher, is your point. So while there may be benefits, the risks are higher. So more control probably makes more sense, is your point.
Yeah, and especially when you're using it for you're using cannabis by and large. Correct me if I'm wrong. You're more the expert than I. It seems the biggest bucket out from a medicinal point of view is around pain management and dealing with pain.
It's not quite. I mean, everything. I mean, you think about pain's obviously one big one without a doubt, but anxiety is a huge one, as you know.
Okay, but
seizures. But yeah.
But we're talking about, when we're talking psychedelics, tend to be more serious types of mental health conditions, like PTSD, for example.
Yeah.
So we're talking about some serious stuff that, if not handled correctly, these are all tools that have to be used in conjunction with other tools to get to the right result. And if they have the potential to make those mental health conditions worse if not used appropriately.
Fair enough. So your next question, what is something you've learned in the last month that you think the audience might find interesting?
I've learned in the last month that this space is rapidly evolving. It used to be sort of the untalked about space, and yet it seems to be getting a lot of attention, not just from entrepreneurs and venture capitalists who see a potential market, but also from the press as well. Articles in the New York Times, articles in well-established media, are talking about it. So this has gone from being something that was sort of underground and in the dark to something that people are talking about and saying, well, wait a minute, maybe there really is benefit. What if this does help people with mental illness? What if this does become a treatment? And I think COVID and people being locked down and the resulting mental health challenges as a result of that for all of us has kind of given psychedelics their time. It's the right time to start having these conversations.
We're moving away from the moonshine version of psychedelics towards the Coors Light, if you will. So we'll see how that plays out.
Or the use of illicit drugs in the club, in the dark nightclub setting, to more. Can these things really help people? Can we really?
Yeah.
And we have limited tools. So what we really need are more tools.
We should have a whole conversation on tools. I think that'd be a fun conversation as well.
I think there are a lot more tools, and I think we're also getting. I think the scientists are getting better at discussing how do you measure mental health improvements? How does mental health work? What else does it affect? What affects it? I think we're getting a better understanding of the biology, the basic biology. I think we're getting a better understanding of how this all fits together. The mind, we've heard for decades the mind-body connection, but I think we're starting to actually show objectively the mind-body connection and how that actually really works. I think we're getting smarter about it. We got a long way to go.
Yeah. Last question. What's something that made you happy in the last week?
Made me happy in the last week?
Yeah.
Honestly, chasing my dog around the house.
Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah.
The one that was barking?
Yeah, the one that was barking. The smallest one has the biggest mouth.
They always do. I love it. Again, just to remind everyone, you can find Seth at Whitelaw at whitelawcompliance.com or go to his website at whitelawcompliance.com. Seth, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me, Darshan. It's been a pleasure.
Take care.
Bye-bye.